The book is From Aristotle to Christ, How Aristotelian Thought Clarified the Christian Faith. Can I ask you right off the bat, what first led you to see Aristotle not as a rival to the gospel, but as a resource for clarifying it?
Well, this is great. And thanks for having me on. I am the big Athens and Jerusalem guy. What I really want to do is bring together the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian together. So I've got a book called The Myth Made Fact, reading Greek and Roman mythology through Christian eyes. But this book is the conclusion of a trilogy. Many years ago, I published From Achilles to Christ, Why Christians Should Read the Pagan Classics. And I looked at the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and the Greek tragedies on their own and how they point forward to Christ. Then many years later, I had to do From Plato to Christ. And that was about 3 years ago, also with InterVarsity. And I looked at all of Plato's work and how it influenced the Christian church, and I think for good rather than for bad. But if you're going to do Plato, you have to do Aristotle. Now, I am more a Platonist than an Aristotelian. I love Aristotle, especially his ethics, but still, I knew that it was going to be a real deep dive. So I spent a year going through everything, rereading it, trying to find what Aristotle did as opposed to what Plato did. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons I wrote the Plato book is, okay, whenever you're like a theological liberal from the mainline denomination, if there's something you don't like in the New Testament, in the Bible, what you do is you say, well, that's St. Paul, and you try to get around it that way. But if you're an actual evangelical, you cannot get away with saying that's St. Paul, right? So what I found a lot of people do is they say, well, that's just Plato. And so I'm like, enough of this, okay? You're getting rid of Plato because you don't like hierarchy and all sorts of things that you should like. And so I had to write that. But then I said, let's look at Aristotle. And Aristotle brings in a different perspective. He not only brings in I think, more practical view of ethics and a more practical view of politics, but the more you read Aristotle, it's sort of a miracle because Plato got so many things right, but he still attached himself to that very Greek idea that our souls are trapped in our bodies and want to be liberated. In Aristotle, now obviously we're not quite at an incarnational view where we are enfleshed souls, but he has this thing he calls hylomorphism, which is a big word, but it basically means that form and matter are more integral in Aristotle than they are in Plato. And to me, that's one of the most important things that Aristotle, from a Christian point, got right. Also, Aristotle had a profound influence on Aquinas and therefore a profound influence on Dante. And I am an absolute Dante lover. I'm in the riddle of writing a book on Dante for Classical Academic Press. So I wanted to assess a little bit more. Also, even though C.S. Lewis, my mentor, is very much a Platonist, also he was influenced by Aristotle, especially when it came to ethics, but also when it came to the cosmological model of the universe. Some of it is in Plato, but the fuller view of the universe is really Aristotelian, and that had a profound influence on so many areas of life. So again, basically, I had to challenge myself and say, even though the great Samuel Coleridge said everyone's either a Platonist or an Aristotelian, and even though I'm a Platonist at heart, I needed to do the deep dive into Aristotle and found a lot of stuff that I think is very helpful for Christians and for the church in general.
If Plato and Aristotle could have communicated with one another, would you think they would have got along?
Oh, they did. Oh, and in
Oh, they
fact,
did. Okay.
Plato was the single greatest influence in Aristotle. So,
Yeah.
and Aristotle worked for Plato for a while
Oh,
at
there
the
you go.
academy before he
Okay.
went off on his own. So they're not. See, a lot of people have this idea, and you may have seen that famous painting. It's really a fresco called "The School of Athens," right, by Raphael. And you see them all arranged on the stairs, and in the middle are Plato and Aristotle. And Plato, the picture of Plato is actually based on Leonardo da Vinci, what he looks like. It's kind of fun. And Plato is pointing upward, right, towards the forms, the ideas, and Aristotle's got his hand like this going back. Now, there is some truth to saying Aristotle brought philosophy back to earth, but it's wrong to think that Plato was somehow a transcendentalist that believed in ideas that were beyond our world, and Aristotle was some kind of a modern naturalist and materialist. That is simply not true. For Plato, his orientation was from top to bottom. So everything in our world is ultimately an imitation of the real idea, right? So in our world, you have all sorts of chairs, different colors, different shapes, different textures, but we recognize them all as chairs because for Plato, they participate in the idea of the chair, the form of the chair, chairness, chair with a capital C. And that such is true for objects. It's true for things like goodness and truth and beauty and justice. They participate in a greater reality that is universal and unchanging, which is a little bit closer to Christianity. What Augustine did is said, you're right, Plato, but I'm going to take your forms and put them in the mind of God. And I think he solved that problem of bringing it together, right? Now, what Aristotle did is he didn't deny that there were absolutes. His orientation, instead of being from top to bottom, it's from the center to the outside, right? So he still believed that there were forms. He just didn't want to put them way up out of reach and all that sort of stuff and being too abstract. What Aristotle gave us is the belief that everything has a telos, T-E-L-O-S, which means a purposeful end. Everything, every object, every animal, every human being has a purpose. And that idea is not modern materialistic, postmodern Enlightenment idea, right? That just says we're born and we have no essence, right? We make everything up as we go along, everything evolves. Not for Aristotle. For Aristotle, there is a form, a little bit different than Plato's form, but there is an idea, a purpose, an essence that precedes matter. And so it's very important. And in fact, one of the reasons I mentioned earlier, Aristotle comes a little closer to the Christian understanding of how we are both body and soul and enfleshed soul. We're 100% physical and 100% spiritual. Is he didn't like this idea that there was only one soul. He understood that each soul was fitting of the matter. So he's coming to something that's actually a little bit more incarnational than Plato's idea. So I think he's a very good corrective. You see it in Aquinas. He understands what Aristotle's trying to do and how he's groping toward a fuller understanding of the nature of reality.
What category, from today's categories, how do you think we would categorize Aristotle? Whether, we always call him a pagan, but would you say, like, in our terms, atheist, theist,
Oh, I mean, no,
like,
he certainly is a theist.
okay,
I mean, what sets him apart from Christians, obviously, ultimately, is he doesn't have a personal God. He certainly doesn't have a triune God, but he doesn't really have a personal God. He's got what he called the unmoved mover. Almost all of Aristotle's arguments for the existence of God, and they were influenced Aquinas and others, is that we need a mover that is himself unmoved to set everything into motion. We need a cause that is itself causeless, right? That is the ultimate cause. Or then you end up with the childish question that Richard Dawkins asked, if God invented man, who invented God? Well, you don't even understand what the word God means. When you say that, that's a childish response, okay? Even Aristotle is understanding there needs to be a beginning. He would have been kind of okay with the Big Bang, right? It's like, okay, now, I should say that Aristotle is that strange person. Christians believe in the beginning was spirit. All the naturalists believe in the beginning was matter. Aristotle actually theorized that both God and the universe were eternal, which makes him strange. There's very few people that say that. But still, the fact that he believes in the beginning there was a spiritual beginning that set everything in motion and that continues to set everything in motion. That's what's important. But again, he really cannot conceive of that God as personal. You can contemplate that God.
okay.
You can't really know him in the personal way that Christians know the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But still, he is a theist, right? And even maybe more a theist even than a deist, because that God is involved, at least in getting things started. I mean, again, it's unfair to just say that Aristotle's God is merely a watchmaker God who doesn't care. There's a little more involvement, a little more dynamism in
Okay.
Aristotle's cosmos. But again, his God is not personal. That's just something that we need some special revelation for that.
But if he was here today, he would be more sympathetic to Christians in the church probably than like a Dawkins or a Hitchens or
Oh,
like,
yes. Oh, yeah. And in some ways, he would be an intelligent design theorist,
okay,
okay? Because he's the one that saw the design and purpose in everything.
okay,
So, yes, whether he would have come to faith, I don't know, but he would not have been a new atheist. They want to
okay.
say that I mean, he's the one that gives us logic in all of these things. But again, he's gives us a world that is purposeful,
Okay.
that has meaning, that has order and harmony and balance. It is not a random world. Like, okay, there were people back in the time of Aristotle who were what you would call evolutionists. They called themselves atomists. Now, an atom, the Greek word atom means cannot be cut. Atom. It's like nothing can be nothing smaller than an atom. So they believed that in the world were all these little bits of matter called atoms, and they floated like this through the void. And as they floated through the void, they would collide with each other, and that produced everything we know. So basically, time plus chance plus the swerve of the atom. Okay, Aristotle was not an atom. First of all, Aristotle didn't believe there was any vacuum in space. He obviously got that wrong. The phrase nature abhors a vacuum is actually not true, but it goes back to Aristotle because Aristotle believed that in this dynamic world, everything pushed everything else. That's why Aristotle had to put the earth at the center of the universe because it's the only way he could explain gravity. They didn't have that word, but they understood things fell down because we need a center and everything pushes to the center unless you're fire and you rise away from the center and you go up. But everything in this world is ordered. Okay, maybe like Newton. I mean, he would see a clockwork universe, but that doesn't mean it is a universe empty of spirit or empty of God. So maybe a little bit more like a Newton. People still debate whether Newton was a Christian, a theist, whatever he was, but he certainly believed in God. Newton. He wrote more about biblical prophecy than he wrote about physics. So he's pretty serious about the Bible, Newton.
Thinking about this unmoved mover, are there ways in which the unmoved mover illuminates aspects of the biblical God? And
Oh,
then
I
I
think
guess where does
so.
it fall short?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, sometimes we're too quick to talk about God as omnipotent, all powerful, omniscient, all knowing, omnipresent. But a lot of these ideas do go back to Plato and Aristotle, and they're not bad ideas. We're trying to theorize if God is God, what must he be? And we got to remember we need an origin for everything. A way to put that, Ryley, is water never rises above its source, right? I mean, so much of modern materialism is a misunderstanding that the cause has to be greater than what it causes. The cause has to be greater than the effect. So a good way to put this is Freud famously wrote a book called Moses and Monotheism. And what he said was that Moses essentially invented God the Father by taking his human father and projecting him upwards, right? Even John Locke, who wasn't always so Christian, said, well, the reason we have the idea of infinity is we just counted our numbers, finitude, and we went up and up and up and up and said, oh, there's infinity. Descartes said the opposite. Descartes before Locke. Locke is answering Descartes. Descartes said, no, our idea of infinity must be from above because the difference between finitude, counting, and infinity is not quantitative, 1, 2, 3, 4 million. It's qualitative. It's a leap, right? And so Descartes was right about that. And again, Aristotle would understand that. So basically, the Christian response to Freud is no, no, no. Divine fatherhood is not a projection upward of earthly fatherhood. Earthly fatherhood is a reflection and imitation of divine fatherhood. That's Platonic, but it's also Aristotelian. To understand that, again, the origin is up there. You can't, Freud is like, you start with this animal lust, and somehow or other, it, boom, And what's the word he uses? It sublimates itself into love. Well, no, I'm sorry. Love is not evolved lust. Lust is a falling away from divine love. That's really the way the universe, that's the way physics works. Aristotle understood that the cause the origin has to be greater than what it gives. The cause is greater than the effect. And again, that's behind a lot of arguments between sort of materialism and God. Is we need something to begin. We need, if there's a big bang, we need a big banger. We need something and we also need an origin for conscience, consciousness, all of reason, even imagination. All the things that rise us above the animal kingdom needs to come from above, right? Because our reason is able to step outside nature and study nature and even change it. So these ideas, which are powerful in C.S. Lewis, Aristotle understood that. We have forgotten, and we want to just get a desiccated version of Aristotle. Oh, he just brings things to earth and says that Plato is silly. That's not what he's doing. He's just trying to get more. And that's why the title they gave was From Plato to Christ, how Platonic thought shaped the Christian faith. I asked him to do how Aristotelian thought clarified the Christian faith, because Aristotle is the great person who categorizes everything and helps us to order it and figure out how it all works together. And of course, Aquinas is the Christian Aristotelian. His Summa basically organizes and codifies everything in the universe and finds all those correspondences. So Aristotle is the greater influence on the Middle Ages than Plato in many ways. It's the high Middle Ages. Okay, it took a while to get Aristotle back, but that whole vision of an ordered universe where everything has its place and its role, that powerful vision that's both in Dante and in Chaucer, that is coming very much from Aristotle, through Boethius, through other people, but it's an Aristotelian vision.
What about the clarifying nature then of Aristotle's view of telos? Is there a way that telos really has helped the church, whether Aquinas or before him or after him, help the church articulate things like creation, providence, redemption?
It is, because we have to understand, we're not just in a world without meaning and without purpose. We are in a meaningful world. Look, Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialists, they've got this simple way of saying it: existence precedes essence. In other words, we're born as a blank slate. There's nothing essential, nothing written into us. We're just here, thrown into the world, and we make up our essence as we go along. Ryley, a lot of people say they believe that, but I don't think anybody actually believes that, because almost anybody you meet, even if they're an atheist, has this belief that they are a meaningful being that has some kind of purpose, and their job is to figure out what their purpose is, to figure out what their talents are. Even if they think nature gave them their talents rather than God, they understand that we're not a blank slate, right? It's just sort of crazy. So we need to come back, and I think that's a bridge we can make between people, that we do have a unique purpose, unique gifts, unique talents that we need to use to fulfill our purpose. And that is important language that Plato gave us, so we can understand that. I think it's important when we understand masculine and feminine. We've kind of forgotten. We act like men and women are exactly the same, this egalitarian equity nonsense. We are not exactly the same, okay? Because we're all made in God's image, we have equal worth and value, but we are not the same. We have different functions. We have different essences. The best way to put it is, it's not just our bodies that are masculine and feminine, it's our souls. Right? It says that God, male and female, created he them. He made us male and female. And we all have the same telos, that famous Westminster Confession, to glorify God and enjoy him forever. But there's also other smaller roles, and I think Aristotle helps us there as well, so we don't collapse everything into some kind of amorphous sameness, which is not what the Gospels teach. The Gospels give us a world where everybody has equal value, but there is a kind of a hierarchy. There are differences. And too many Americans, especially evangelicals, get all uncomfortable with any kind of difference between people. And it's like, no, that's good. We each have and Aristotle is not the only one, but he kind of gives us this idea that was very, very popular and it's extremely popular in Dante. The idea that the movement of the spheres, the perfect circular movement of the spheres, casts an influence on us on the earth. That's what astrology is. That's why if you go to an astrologist, all he needs to know is one piece of information, exactly when you were born. Because the idea is that the heavens, the formation of the heavens when you were born, gives you your destiny. Now, the Christians did not believe we were fated, okay? But it did believe that there's influence. I mean, we now believe this microscopic thing called DNA influences everything about us, right? I love it. Young people I would never let my parents choose my husband or wife, but I'll let a computer choose my husband or wife. I mean, really? Okay. We prefer mechanism to something that's actually more personal. So again, the fuller, and even in Aristotle, he's not saying everything's fated. It depends on how we receive the influence. So the influence of Mars is martial, right? If you receive it poorly, you'll be like a tyrant or a killer. If you receive it well, you'll be a brave soldier, even a martyr, as Dante says when he gets to visit the sphere of Mars in Paradiso. So this idea, again, is a world where there are correspondences both horizontally and vertically. Things are linked together. That's the whole concept of holistic medicine, is that health is a kind of balance. We need to balance the liquids in our body. We need to balance the energy in our body, all of it. I think this is a very powerful vision. And today we identify that with the East, and that's true, but that was Western medicine, not before the Renaissance, but before the Enlightenment. During the Renaissance, they still considered the balance. They considered that because man was a microcosm, in other words, all of nature is reflected in us. That's the whole idea of like cures like. You find certain herbs that match up with certain parts of your body. I don't think there's anything new age about this, okay? The Bible says we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, Ryley, the reason everybody laughs at this idea is because the only thing they know about it is that in the old days, if they thought you had too much blood, they might bleed you and let out some blood. And that's all anybody knows about it. And it's such a bastardization of a concept of health that, again, we see in traditional Chinese medicine and in India and stuff like that. Health is a balance between the different parts of our body. That is a very Aristotelian vision of the cosmos.
How did the early church first, and maybe there's multiple answers, is how did they first encounter Aristotelian thought, and what were some of the factors that made them receptive to it?
Okay, let me start by saying that Christians, we know that the Bible says that Christ came in the fullness of times, right? What does that mean? He didn't just randomly come. It wasn't like God spun a globe and put his finger and said, there we go. Have you ever tried to do that? Where's my vacation? And you always end up in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean somewhere, drowning. But it wasn't random, okay? He came. Now, I think most Christians probably understand that fullness of times, Jesus was born at the beginning of the Roman Empire when there was this thing called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, the longest reign of peace the Western world has known. The Roman roads connected the whole empire. The waterways were safe for travel. Paul could not have spread the gospel in Acts without. So a lot of people understand that Roman law and order and justice facilitated the spread of the Bible. But I would argue that part of that fullness of times was Greco-Roman philosophy as well. Hebrew is a great language for poetry and prophecy. It's not as good for theology and the specificity that you can do in the Greek language and later in the Latin language with the Vulgate. But of course, the New Testament is written in Greek. And the translation of the Old Testament to Greek called the Septuagint was the one that was being used more in Jesus' time anyway. So what you get is a language that carries with it Platonic and Aristotelian understandings of how things are organized, right? So it's very helpful. You probably know this in the Nicene Creed. And in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of the Father before all ages, light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. Consubstantial, homoousin in Greek, or of one substance. That kind of language is very Platonic as we're trying to understand the different. Like, for instance, when the Catholic Church talks about what happens at the Mass, what they call transubstantiation, they're still using Aristotelian terminology, because Aristotle distinguishes between substance and accident. Substance is the essence of a thing, and without that essence, it's no longer is that thing, right? A certain dog has an essence, but the accidents are whether it has short fur or long fur, whether it's big or small, right? So, this shirt has the essence of a shirt, but it could be white or red or purple or yellow or whatever. Those would be its accidents. Well, in transubstantiation, what they're saying is happening is that when the bread and wine are being transformed, transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ, the accidents remain the same. It is still bread and wine, right? So the taste, all that sort of stuff. But the substance, the essence of it, has been transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ. That's why Christians are not cannibals, right? So, they found a language like that from Aristotle that helped them to define something they believed in as Christians, but it was hard to find a terminology to explain that. Especially, again, Hebrew is a more poetic language. It doesn't have that kind of specificity that you get in Greek and Roman.
Are there any early Christian authors, whether biblical authors or even early church fathers, that are especially Aristotelian in thought?
It is hard. Like I said, in the beginning, the influence of Plato is a little bit stronger,
Okay.
right? But again, it's a way of thinking that you see. Like Irenaeus is the first systematic theologian. Just the idea of being systematic and coming up with a terminology that will explain things and allow you to codify them, that is a more Aristotelian frame of mind. The high season of Aristotle comes when Aristotle is brought back to Europe and Aquinas deals with him. But again, he's there in the early church in his terminology and his systematization of things that you can see that are hard to, again, it's hard to express these truths apart from that.
Are there ways that Aristotle's logic served early Christian apologetics in catechesis? And could you maybe just kind of intro some of the logic of Aristotle?
Okay, first of all, Aristotle said things that may sound obvious, but they're not obvious till you say them. The law of non-contradiction. A cannot also be B at the same time and in the same way, in the same space, right? You can't just have contradictions like you do in Greek mythology and stuff, like radical contradictions. So he's systematizing our thought that way, right? He also talks about the difference between induction and deduction. So induction means you start with facts and figures and observations, and on the basis of that, you work your way up to an inference. So if you're a doctor, you can collect all the symptoms and you come up with a diagnosis. But Aristotle preferred deduction, where you begin with givens, with truths that transcend us, and you work your way down to a specific answer. And he did that in the form of what we call a syllogism. It starts with a major premise. All men are mortal. You don't really try to prove that. It is a given. All men are mortal. Then the minor premise is a fact. Socrates is a man. Therefore, you can conclude Socrates is mortal. If all men are mortal, Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Right? But you have to do it right. And he got us to think logically about things. Now, what's interesting is, Ryley, you might be thinking, I've never heard anybody speak like that. Well, that's because we don't speak in syllogisms, we speak in enthymemes. We say this: Socrates is a man, therefore he's mortal. We leave the major premise unspoken because it's so obvious. But sometimes we need to track down what is behind it. We need a creed to tell us what is the given. See, first truths are not things we argue for, they're things we argue from. We begin, for instance, with the authority of Scripture, and from there we work our way down. We begin with God as omnipotent, omniscient, and we work our way down. So this idea of doing doctrine and having something fixed that will allow you to reason allows you to do philosophy and theology. Theology is kind of philosophy mixed together with the Bible and with faith. Of course, you probably know that Richard Dawkins laughs at the concept of theology because he can't believe that you could say anything logical about God, right? So he actually laughs about, there's no such thing, it's ridiculous, right? But no, God has given us reason, and we can use reason to try to sort of categorize and figure out how things work in terms of cause and effect. Maybe the most important thing he did, now this is moving forward to his logic, and very, very influential even today, is what he called the four causes. You may have heard that phrase before. At almost anything, you can identify one of four causes that caused it. He called them the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. So if you ask me, what is the cause of the famous statue of David by Michelangelo? The material cause is the marble out of which it was made. It was actually one piece of flawed marble out of which David was sculpted, right? If you ask me what the formal cause is, well, the formal cause is that Michelangelo had in his mind the essence or shape of the human form, the bipedal man, everything that goes with what it means to be human, the essence. The efficient cause is the direct cause and effect, and that's Michelangelo, the artist himself, the sculptor. But the final cause, which gives you the telos, the final cause of Michelangelo's David is to glorify God and man. If you are in a room with me and the teapot goes off and it makes that whistling sound, and I say, why is that teapot whistling? You can give me a sort of material efficient cause and say that the air bubbles have reached a certain velocity, and as they push themselves through the aperture, it makes a whistling sound. That's a true answer. But there's another answer to why is that teapot whistling. You know what that answer is? Because I want a cup of tea. Okay? And what's happened in the modern world is we want to eliminate the formal cause and the final cause, and all we care about is the material and efficient cause. And Aristotle said, no, we need all of these causes. There is a cause behind the cause. Spinoza, who really is the first modern thinker, I think he's worse than Descartes. Descartes got some things right. But Spinoza said, there are no final causes. There's just efficient causes going on forever. An endless chain of cause and effect, and it's got no beginning. Now, Aristotle said, if you don't have a causeless cause, a groundless ground, a beginning of everything, then you get what's called infinite regress. Now, Nietzsche didn't have much trouble with that, but it just goes on and on forever and nothing stops it. Well, it's not the way of reality, okay? But we need this today because, again, we don't want to ask the deeper question. We just want to know this caused this, but I mean, again, it's really funny. Okay, you understand that pure Darwinism is dead. Nobody believes in Darwinism. First of all, 4 billion years is not enough time for Darwinism, okay? Darwinism is slow incremental changes. That's not what anybody believes. What they believe now is a fusion of Darwinism and the idea that every so often there is a mutation that causes change, right? So basically they saved Darwin by killing Darwin because Darwin said nature makes no leaps. That's called saltationism in Latin. And now that's what they do. It's like, no, but okay. The funny thing is that the way that works, and it sort of works, it doesn't really work, is because every time our DNA replicates itself, it has the possibility of a miscoding that can lead to a genetic mutation. Now, anybody that is fair-minded knows that mutations make you weaker and almost always make you sterile. So I don't even think that works, but it doesn't make a difference. Let's say it works. You still haven't told me where the DNA come from, right? Because the DNA is front-loaded with information, more than a supercomputer, right? As even, what's his name? The Apple guy admitted, right? It's front-loaded with all this information. I can't make a supercomputer like that. But again, we just think we can look at little cause effect, and we don't ask for the greater purpose by where it really came from, what its formal cause is. And of course, transgenderism is a complete rejection of formal cause. There is no form. We're just whatever we want to make ourselves into. No, there is a form that has impressed itself upon us, and there is a final cause that points towards an ultimate purpose or ultimate cause or ultimate reason. And when we forget that, things just fall apart. Okay, we're just living in a moment of now without anything to point back to fix meaning in some meaningful way.
Maybe it's not fair to take him from this time and put him into this time, but just as you speak, I keep thinking, I think Aristotle would be rejecting a lot of our, you talk about transgenderism or
Oh, yeah.
just the flattening of genders. Like, I don't want to put him in a political camp or, label him this or that, but I feel like he would be holding on to a lot of the same values and morals
Yeah, there is.
concepts of the world that Christians.
There is a form behind things. It's not all random. You don't just choose whatever you want to do. Okay, we have a system that establishes things, but it's a good system for him, right? His idea of ethics. Here, look. Here's something we need to understand from him. Okay, you probably heard this before. Um, Aristotle said that virtue is the mean between the extremes. So courage is the midpoint between cowardice, which is a lack of courage, and rash foolhardiness, cockiness, which is the excess, right? For Aristotle, courage is not a soldier going berserker and running and screaming and killing people. That's rashness. That is not courage. Courage has to bring with it a knowledge of what's going on and a knowledge of risk and everything. It's not just rashness and craziness, right? But it's a little bit deeper than that. Virtue is ultimately an action, not an emotion. The classical virtue of courage doesn't mean I feel brave. It means even when I'm terrified, I stay at my post and act out courage. But the more we act virtuously, the more that virtue will become a habit and we will become a virtuous person, right? For Aristotle, there are standards of virtue. The modern virtue signaling is values, not virtues. Values change back and forth. They're fashionable. They're linked to internal feelings. They are not linked to, absolute universal codes of conduct. So he would be sort of horrified by that and how we have emotionalized everything and whatever I feel is right. That's not the way it goes, okay? There is a standard for things. And I think Aristotle needs to remind us of that and remind the church of that. That, it's not about what you feel. That feelings aren't bad, okay? But feelings do not determine things. That's the danger, Ryley, of a 3 or 4 generations now that think the only reason for marriage is this emotional experience called being in love. I don't want to sound like a non-romantic here, okay? But if you think the only proper foundation of marriage is a feeling of love, what happens 10 years later when you don't feel those warm fuzzies anymore? You get up and leave? I mean, if you think that the only cause of love or marriage is that emotional state, then everything's going to fall apart. There's got to be something deeper than it. And Lewis talks about this, but it's very Aristotelian. Okay, Book 1 of Mere Christianity is an argument for God, for theism. Book 2 is an argument for Christianity. Book 3 is about living the Christian life. And most of what Lewis says about virtue in book 3 is completely Aristotelian, because Aristotle got it right, right? He got right an understanding of virtue and how virtue works.
And
And how,
Was Lewis reading a lot of Aristotle?
oh yes, yeah, oh yeah,
Okay.
he's quoting, Aristotle's ideas and stuff like that. So in terms of ethics, he got it. Look, if go back to the school of Athens, that famous image, you see Plato and Aristotle, and Plato was holding a book and it says Timeo, the Timaeus, right? But Aristotle is holding a book called Ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, because that's what he was known for. Plato in the Middle Ages, much of Plato was lost. All they had was the Timaeus. They even lost the Republic. They had it through Boethius and through Virgil and through Ovid. There were different channels, but they'd lost a lot of Plato. But they had a little bit more of Aristotle. Of course, Aristotle also influenced mathematics and things like that, influenced the Muslims too with the idea of algebra and math and things like that. But with Aristotle, coming back to classical Christian education, I just came back from speaking at Tulsa, coming back from classical Christian education, again, it's an Aristotelian understanding of virtue that's being instilled in people. It's not this value clarification stuff that's causing a great deal of damage in our schools and in our society when you teach kids that values are whatever you feel at the moment and they can change, rather than aligning yourself against a standard of virtue. That's both Platonic and Aristotelian in slightly different ways, but they're both understanding the standards are there and we measure ourselves against them. Aristotle's a little more geek, because instead of giving us an abstract form, he says something very practical. Virtue means behaving like a virtuous person. Now, what he means by that is someone who has practiced virtue so long it has become a habit. And that person can become a role model. And remember, St. Paul says, imitate me. He's not trying to take away from Jesus. He's just saying, imitate me in the way I'm serving Christ, because it clearly has become a habit for Paul. Right? No matter what happens, they beat him, they whip him, they throw him in jail. They make a difference, okay? He still does the Lord's work, because by doing it again and again, it has formed a habit. Look, you want pure Aristotle, even though they probably didn't know they were doing that. Did you ever see the movie Fireproof? Do you remember that Christian movie called Fireproof? Yeah. If you're a man and suddenly you decide you no longer love your wife, what do you do about it? Well, you spend the next 30 days treating your wife as if you love her. And if you treat her as if you love her, sooner or later, the feelings of love will return. By the way, no Christian has enough guts to make the other movie. If you're a woman and you feel that you no longer respect your husband, what do? You spend the next 30 days treating your husband as if you respect him, and then the respect will come back. It sort of works both ways. But again, that concept is very Aristotelian. It's about building up a habit. Okay, here's an easier way to put it, Ryley. Instead of our actions being driven by our emotions need to be driven by our proper actions and proper habits. Lewis says every so often you have to tell your emotions where they get off. Okay? And you do it. Now, to a modern American, doesn't that sound really, really phony? You're going to treat your wife as if you love her? That sounds hypocrite. No, it's not. It's the way the human machine works. You act to serve. Look, if you've ever worked in an office, if you've unfortunately had to work in an office, right? Let's say the manager treats your coworker in a really nasty fashion. You think, you know what? I'll bet for the next month, I'll bet the manager is going to treat that guy really nicely because he feels bad. No, it's the complete opposite. He will treat that person worse because it's cognitive dissonance. And if I treated him bad, it must be because he's bad, not because I'm a jerk, but because he's bad. And so they treat them worse. Okay? Look, if you are one of these sour-faced Christians and you've been working at a soup kitchen for 10 years and you still resent and hate the people that you're serving, then you are not embodying the theological virtue of caritas or charity or love, agape, right? If you are properly acting out love, then the feelings of love will start to come. Everybody has a bad day, but the feelings of love will come. That's why I'm not saying I believe in arranged marriages, but a lot of arranged marriages worked because the love followed the commitment. I don't think we have to go back to that, but understand that, that's psychologically possible and seems to have happened. There seems to have been a lower divorce rate because people learned to love one another and have the feelings to follow the actions.
What has happened to philosophy that that we're scared for our children now to enter philosophy because they're going to come out nihilists and they're going to lose the faith, when it seems like you could, I mean, as you say on the title, Aristotle is clarifying the Christian faith. he
Yes.
he doesn't seem to be moving us toward some nihilistic perspective. He seems to be moving us closer to a Christian perspective, Christian virtues. Like what has happened to,
I mean,
I don't know, philosophical education?
yeah, two very influential people, you may have heard their names, are Richard Swinburne from England and Alvin Plantinga from America.
Sure. Yeah.
And they were part of a philosophical resurgence. I'm trying to remember, 30 years ago, maybe it started. And when they started, almost every philosophy department was completely secular, humanist, atheist. And philosophy has been brought back. In
Okay.
fact, I mean, a lot of places are at least theistic. I mean, a real philosopher no longer thinks the problem of pain disproves Christianity because Alvin Plantinga showed them, no, it's rational. Now, that you still have what you call the pastoral problem of pain, how you deal one-on-one with the person. But philosophically speaking, this idea that there's pain does not in and of itself disprove the existence of God. Plantinga is being very Aristotelian in trying to argue that and telling us, how do you define a word like love? How do you define all of these things, and what do they mean, and what's the criteria? So they did help win it back. But this is me speaking. I think that even Christians have gotten too, what's the word I want? This kind of philosophy that's so abstract, using all these figures. It's like, talk like a real person. Talk like Peter Kraft. Then people will join philosophy, right? Talk like them, and then what are called analytic philosophers. I mean, I know a lot of them that I respect, but I think it drives people away. Let's get back to good Socratic, Platonic dialogues where we really dialogue and ask questions like, what is the nature of goodness and truth and beauty, and what is the nature of God? And see, part of the problem is that a lot of people during the Enlightenment just gave up on ontology. Ontology means the study of being. What is the nature of things? What is the nature of God? And with Kant, everything became epistemology, which means the study of knowing. So they don't even care whether God exists. How do you know that God exists? But then they don't even bother asking whether he does exist, right? You talk to an epistemologist about speaking in tongues, they couldn't care less whether that actually happens or whether there's a Holy Spirit. They're just looking at the psychological causes of it, okay? And we need epistemology, but I think we push it too far sometimes,
Okay.
and we need to get back to the thingness of things. What is a thing, and not just how do we know it? What is it apart from our knowledge of it? And sometimes we've moved into just linguistics. I mean, where we've given up on everything. And I do think we need to be more aggressive, but also more. We want to bring back the good, the true, and the beautiful. We want to make it appealing. Dive in there. And what I do in my book, and I explain it, I try to go in chronological order, and I reward everybody. The first two chapters on logic and on physics are very difficult. It took me a long time to write them. I made them as clear as I could. But if you can get through that, you will find that ethics, politics, poetics, rhetoric is much easier to understand because it's more practical. See, the reason Aristotle is so hard to understand is we don't have any books that Aristotle wrote. I'm going to use a modern example, but what we have, imagine if I was one of those teachers that used PowerPoints, okay? And then I died. And my students took my PowerPoints and tried to reconstruct my lectures as books. That's what we have.
Okay.
That's why they're very sketchy. That's why they don't have as many illustrations as you would like, right? By the way, we know that Aristotle wrote a number of dialogues like Plato, but we've lost all of them. I wish we could get them and see what they sounded like. But so that's why sometimes it is hard. It just seems like a mathematical proof you're working your way through because there's a nakedness there. It's just the PowerPoints. Is that what is that map behind you? Is that Narnia? No, what is that?
This right here?
Yeah.
That's actually just kind of a close up of some tree bark that I saw in
Oh my gosh, it looks like a map.
in
Okay.
Panama. And it was just it was so colorful that
Okay.
I went and then Put it on
I'm
the
trying to
wall.
figure out what that map is. Okay. Okay, go on.
It does from far away look like a Narnian
Yeah.
Tolkien type map. Luce, I don't want to keep you longer. I know you got an appointment coming up here. Can I just ask you, what do you most hope the church today will rediscover about Aristotle that could strengthen its witness in the 21st century?
Okay. The funny thing is that Aristotle did not have the imagination that Plato did. Plato
Okay.
came up with all those beautiful myths. But the funny thing is that whereas Plato says at the end of the Republic, we have to kick the poets out of our republic because they're taking us away from truth, Aristotle was the first great defender of the arts. He said, okay, Plato said that when I am writing a poem about a tree, that tree is an imitation of the form of the tree. When I write a poem or paint a painting of the tree, I am making another imitation. So my tree is twice removed from the form of the tree. The Greek word for imitation is mimesis, mimetic. And it's where we get the word mime from, the mime who imitates. So the for Plato, the poet is taking us farther away from the truth, twice removed. And Aristotle said, no, 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 no. True mimesis takes us closer to the truth. What a great tragedy, he wrote a book called The Poetics. What a great tragedy does is take a story that's kind of all over the place and episodic, and through the process of imitation, doesn't take it farther away from the ideal, but brings it closer to the ideal. So things work as they would work in a perfect world of cause and effect and purpose and meaning. And so he's doing and this is so important because we're still fighting, particularly evangelicals who are suspicious of fiction and poetry and film and whatnot. And it's like, no, we have to have discernment. Okay, there's a lot of bad stuff out there. But no, the true use of the arts, Aristotle showed us, can bring us closer to the truth. So we need that part of Aristotle that helps us to see the perfection of things, how things work as they should, and gives us a glimpse of something more ideal. I think that's very, very helpful. And also just man is a political animal. That's a famous phrase from his book, The Politics, that we need to learn to live in groups. And that is important. And we have to get along. You know what I've been telling my students lately, Ryley? Because they're all afraid to get married because the divorce rate is so high. I tell them, hey, you want to lower your chance of divorce? I'm going to tell you what to do. Once you join a church, stay there. Stop church hopping all over the place. You're going to do the same thing with your girlfriend or your wife, okay? Now, I mean, obviously, if your church decides to have an openly gay minister, there are some reasons to leave. But there are very few reasons to leave. I don't like the worship. Get used to it. You don't choose your brother or your sister either, right? I mean, husbands and wives divorce, but almost nobody divorces their kids because you get along. You learn how to get along. That's what you do, okay? So the stay in your church, learn what it means to be part of a group, to be the body of Christ. I think Aristotle can help us because he talks about living, and he does tell us, though, that the family is primary, and on the basis of family, you build up and you have the government, things like that. It's important to remember that he said that. So those are just some of the things. And again, we need logic again because we are being so illogical these days, making contradiction left and right and all this. And one of the most scary things of wokeness, we're kind of moving away from it. Woke people were saying basically logic is a white thing. Now that's terrifying because if we no longer have the rules of logic and rational thought, we cannot talk to each other. We cannot have a discussion. And first of all, I can't think of anything more racist than to say that logic is white. Like non-white people are illogical. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. But that's what they were starting to say. They've pulled back a little bit because the tide has turned against them. Thank God for our salvation and our not in God, but our country continuing as a democracy. We need to be able to have ability to discuss and debate things with. That's why, look, I'm a Baptist, and I always want to laugh at Robert's Rules of Order and how silly they are. But that keeps Baptist churches together, my friend, okay? Because Baptists who usually want to complain about everything, but if it's in that little book, then it's okay. We're the same way with the conservatives are the same way with the Constitution, right? You give me my game book and I'll stick with it. And really, that's even when I'm why are we doing this time? It is causing us to work together and accept. We all accept these rules, and so we'll argue. And guess what? When you have rules, you can't take them personally. It's not that person you hate and resent and envy. It's a rule book, right? So that's kind of an Aristotelian way of thinking that I think the church could use as well.
Lewis, I mean, this whole series has been a gift. This book, no less. I appreciate this project. I'm looking forward to what you do with Dante and the chance to
Great,
talk to you
great.
again about that. Thank you for your time today. This is
Hey, thanks so
yeah,
much.
just such a treat to talk to you.
Maybe we'll do it again when Dante comes out.